It was a warm Sunday afternoon when the Johnson family gathered at their large, elegant home on the outskirts of town. The occasion was a family reunion, an event that took place once every year. The large backyard was decorated with strings of lights and tables covered in white cloth, the smell of grilled food filling the air. Laughter echoed as cousins, aunts, uncles, and children mingled, enjoying the company of one another. Among the guests was Lisa Johnson, the wife of the host, Mark Johnson. She was dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, her eyes scanning the room with a subtle tension. Despite the festive atmosphere, Lisa knew that this gathering would change everything. For months, she had suspected that her husband Mark was having an affair, but it wasn't until a week ago that she found undeniable proof. The confirmation had come in the form of a series of text messages from a woman named Carol. Mark had been seeing Carol behind her back, and now Lisa was ready to confront him. Mark, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, talking to his family members and friends as though everything was normal. His casual demeanor only made Lisa's heart ache more. The betrayal was real, and now she had to decide how to expose it. Should she do it privately, away from the prying eyes of family and friends, or should she take the opportunity to make it public? The decision was made when Lisa overheard Mark laughing with his cousin Tom by the grill. She could feel the anger rising in her chest. She couldn't let this go any longer. With a determined stride, Lisa walked over to the center of the gathering, where everyone was engaged in light-hearted conversations. "Mark!" Lisa called out, her voice firm. "We need to talk." The crowd hushed as all eyes turned toward the couple. Mark looked surprised, his smile faltering for a brief moment. Lisa's face was pale, but her eyes were fiery with the truth she was about to expose. "What is it, Lisa?" Mark asked, his tone still calm, though a slight tremor could be detected. Without giving him a chance to respond, Lisa pulled out her phone, holding it high for everyone to see. "This is for everyone here," she said, her voice shaking slightly but resolute. "This is the truth about what my husband has been doing behind my back." The screen of her phone displayed a series of intimate text messages, photos, and even a few video calls between Mark and Carol. Lisa read some of the messages aloud, making sure every family member in the crowd could hear the painful words. "Mark," she continued, her voice cold now, "I've known for weeks, but I couldn't just sit here and pretend everything was fine anymore. You've been having an affair with this woman, Carol." A gasp spread through the crowd, some members of the family looking shocked, others with a knowing glance exchanged between them. Mark's face turned red, his eyes darting around, unable to make eye contact with anyone. He stammered, trying to find words, but nothing came. "This is a mistake," he finally muttered, his voice weak. "Lisa, you've misunderstood." "Misunderstood?" Lisa interrupted. "I've seen everything, Mark. How could you do this to me? To our family?" Before Mark could respond, Lisa turned on her heel, heading toward the back door. She needed space to breathe, to think. The silence in the backyard was thick, suffocating. As she stepped into the house, the reality of what she had just done began to settle in. There was no turning back now. But what Lisa didn't know was that someone had been watching from the shadows. Their son, Daniel, a quiet 16-year-old who had seen his parents' marriage fall apart over the last few months. He had been aware of the tension at home, and now the public confrontation only seemed to confirm his worst fears. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt an unsettling fear that something terrible was about to unfold. Lisa sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, trying to process everything. Outside, the family was in chaos, whispers and shocked faces everywhere. But deep inside, Lisa knew she had done what was necessary. Or had she? Back outside, Mark stood frozen, unable to speak, his face a mixture of guilt and rage. He had never thought Lisa would air their dirty laundry in such a public way. How could she embarrass him like this? Suddenly, a sharp voice broke the tension. It was Carol, appearing from the edge of the yard, stepping forward with a look of fury in her eyes. "Lisa," she called, "you have no right—" Before Carol could finish her sentence, Mark's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. "Enough," he snapped, his voice low but filled with venom. The look in his eyes was dark, dangerous. It was clear to everyone now. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was angry, and there was more at stake than just a simple affair. The scene was set for a confrontation that would not only tear the family apart, but lead to a tragic and irreversible outcome. The tension in the Johnson family home was palpable. What had begun as a joyous family reunion had quickly turned into a nightmare. As Lisa sat in the kitchen, her mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, humiliation, and anger. She hadn't expected her public confrontation to go as far as it did, but she couldn't deny the relief she felt in finally confronting her husband. Still, the weight of what she had just done pressed heavily on her chest. She could hear raised voices outside, shouts, whispers, and the sounds of people trying to process the chaos. Daniel, their son, walked slowly into the kitchen, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He had been standing just outside the house when the confrontation had unfolded. He had seen his father's face twist in anger, and his heart sank at the thought of how this moment would alter their family forever. "Mom," Daniel said softly, taking a seat beside her. "Is it really true?" Lisa wiped away a tear, nodding slowly. "Yes, Daniel, it's true. Your father has been seeing someone else. Someone who isn't me." Her voice broke on the last word, but she quickly regained her composure. "I didn't want to tell you this way, but I had to. You deserve to know." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes staring down at his hands. He didn't know what to say. The realization that his parents' marriage had been built on lies, and now was completely unraveling, hit him hard. He had hoped it was just a phase, that the fighting would stop and things would go back to normal. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. Meanwhile, outside, Mark stood at the center of the yard, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. Carol stood next to him, glaring at Lisa through the window. Her face was twisted in rage, her lips trembling with anger. Mark had never seen her like this before. She had always been the calm, collected one, always in control. But now her expression was full of venom, a side of her he had never seen. "Why did you do that?" Carol hissed, her voice seething with fury. "You humiliated me in front of everyone, in front of your whole family." Mark couldn't respond. His mind was a whirl of emotions: anger, guilt, shame. But mostly there was a deep, unshakable rage. How dare Lisa expose him like this? How dare she bring their private issues into the open for everyone to see? And now there was no going back. Their marriage was shattered beyond repair, and the worst part was that it wasn't just his fault, it was hers too. She had driven him to this. She had neglected him, ignored him, and pushed him to seek affection elsewhere. Carol, sensing the shift in his mood, took a step back. "Mark, we need to leave. This is getting out of control." But Mark didn't move. He was paralyzed, his thoughts spinning. He needed to make Lisa feel the same way he did. Humiliated, trapped. He needed her to understand that there was no going back from this. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back of the yard. "What's going on here?" It was Tom, Mark's cousin, who had been trying to keep the peace ever since the confrontation had started. He had seen the direction the evening was headed and had been worried about what would happen next. Mark turned to Tom, his eyes wild. "I've had enough, Tom. This woman," he pointed to Carol, who was standing several feet away. "This woman is the only one who gets me. Lisa doesn't understand me anymore." "She never did." Tom shook his head. "You're making a mistake, man. Look at what you're doing. This isn't the way to handle things." But Mark was too far gone. His rage, fed by months of built-up frustration, was overwhelming. His hands shook as he turned to face Carol. "We're leaving. I'm done with this family. I don't care what it costs." Before anyone could stop him, Mark stormed toward the house. Carol followed him, and the two of them entered through the back door. The room fell silent as they walked in, Mark's face a twisted mask of anger. "Lisa," he called out, "you want to air all our dirty laundry? Fine. You want to expose me like that? Let's see how it feels when I expose you." Lisa stood up from the kitchen table, her body rigid with tension. "What are you talking about?" But Mark wasn't listening. He had reached the point of no return. His eyes were wild, his breathing heavy as he moved toward her. "You think you can just humiliate me in front of everyone? You think you can just—" Suddenly, he lunged toward her. In a blur of motion, Mark grabbed Lisa by the wrist, yanking her toward him with surprising strength. She stumbled forward, but before she could react, Carol stepped in, her voice cutting through the air. "Stop, Mark!" Carol screamed, her hands shaking as she grabbed his shoulder and tried to pull him off of Lisa. But it was too late. In that instant, the anger Mark had been carrying for so long exploded. His hands shot up, striking Carol across the face with a force that made her stumble back. The room was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing. Lisa's body lay on the cold, tiled floor, her chest barely rising as she struggled to breathe. Mark stood over her, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Carol, still dazed from the slap, slowly pushed herself to her feet, her eyes darting from Mark to Lisa's prone form. "What the hell did you do?" Carol whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at Mark, then back at Lisa. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she had no idea how to stop it. Mark's expression was one of complete numbness. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing. He had crossed a line he never thought he would. A moment ago, he had been full of anger and hatred, driven by years of resentment toward Lisa. But now, in the aftermath of his actions, a sense of cold dread settled over him. He looked down at Lisa. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, and blood was seeping from a cut on her forehead where her head had hit the floor. He had not meant to hurt her this badly, but in that moment of blind rage, he hadn't been able to control himself. "Mark," Carol said, her voice shaking, "you need to get out of here. This is a disaster." But Mark couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the spot as he stared at his wife, his mind reeling. He had never felt so lost. How could he fix this? How could he undo what he had just done? The guilt was already gnawing at him, but there was no turning back now. Suddenly, the front door flew open, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the house. It was Daniel, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom!" he cried, rushing to her side. His hands trembled as he gently touched her shoulder, trying to shake her awake. "Mom, wake up, please!" Mark stepped back, his body stiff, as his son knelt beside Lisa, desperately trying to rouse her. Carol, still in shock, glanced at the door, knowing they didn't have much time before the rest of the family would come running. "Daniel, get away from her," Mark said hoarsely, his voice low and threatening. "Just get away." Daniel looked up at his father, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. "What did you do to her, Dad? What the hell is going on?" His voice cracked as he spoke, the reality of the situation hitting him hard. "I didn't mean to," Mark began, his voice faltering. He swallowed hard, but the words seemed to choke in his throat. "I didn't mean to hurt her, Daniel," but it was too late for apologies. Daniel was already dialing 911, his hands shaking as he spoke into the phone. "Help! My mom's hurt. She's not breathing right. Please hurry." The operator's voice on the other end was calm, but the urgency of the situation was clear. They told him to stay on the line and to try to perform CPR until paramedics arrived. Mark stood frozen, his eyes locked on his son, his heart pounding in his chest. How could he have done this? His son, his own flesh and blood, was now witnessing the destruction of their family, and it was his fault. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Daniel's hands trembled as he attempted CPR on his mother, his face a mixture of terror and desperation. Mark wanted to help, wanted to do something to make it better, but he couldn't move. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. How could he have let things get this far? The paramedics arrived shortly afterward, their sirens piercing the silence of the house. They rushed inside, quickly assessing the situation. The moment they saw Lisa lying on the floor, unconscious and bleeding, they immediately went to work, checking her vitals and performing more advanced medical procedures. Mark stood in the doorway, watching helplessly as they worked. "Is she going to be okay?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper, as he stood off to the side, his hands still shaking. The lead paramedic looked up at him, his expression grim. "We're doing everything we can, but you need to prepare yourself. It's going to be a long road ahead." Daniel's heart sank. He wanted to believe everything would be okay, but deep down, he knew the truth. His mother was in critical condition, and he wasn't sure if she would ever wake up. As the paramedics loaded Lisa into the ambulance, Daniel followed them outside, his feet moving mechanically. He didn't know what to think or feel. All he could think about was how his family had just shattered in an instant. Everything had changed, and he wasn't sure if there was any going back. Mark stood in the doorway, watching his son and the paramedics leave. He wanted to run after them, to beg for forgiveness, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The realization of what he had done to Lisa, to his son, was too much to bear. He had destroyed his family, and he had no idea how to fix it. The rest of the family arrived in a flurry of activity, their faces full of confusion and fear. The police arrived at the Johnson household just after midnight. The scene was still chaotic, with family members huddled in small groups, whispering amongst themselves. The tension in the air was thick, and every passing minute felt like a reminder of the devastation Mark had brought upon his family. Detective Mia Hayes stepped out of her patrol car, her heels clicking on the pavement as she made her way to the front door. She had been in law enforcement for over 10 years, and this wasn't her first time dealing with domestic violence. But something about this case felt different, darker, more tragic. As she walked into the house, she could see the devastation on the faces of the family members. Mark stood off to the side, his face pale, his hands trembling, while his son, Daniel, sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The paramedics had already left with Lisa, rushing her to the hospital in critical condition. The family was still reeling from the events that had unfolded just hours before. No one had expected the reunion to take such a dark turn. The room was filled with questions, but no answers. "Mr. Johnson," Detective Hayes called, her voice firm but calm. Mark's eyes snapped up at the sound of her voice, and he slowly walked over to her. "I'm Detective Hayes. I need you to come with me for a few questions." Mark didn't resist. He knew what had happened. He knew that his actions had led to this moment. He had never expected to be on the other side of an investigation, but here he was. As Detective Hayes led him to the living room, she took note of the quiet, somber faces around the room. Some were visibly upset, while others were merely confused by the sudden chaos. The family was scattered around the space, trying to process what had happened. She knew she had to be thorough. Lives had been shattered tonight, and it was her job to find out why. "Sit down, Mr. Johnson," she said, motioning to the couch. Mark complied, sitting with his hands folded in his lap, staring down at the floor. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Detective Hayes asked, her tone professional, though she could sense the guilt radiating off him. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the paramedics left. He hadn't spoken to his son. He hadn't spoken to Carol, who had vanished shortly after Lisa was taken away. He was alone with his thoughts and now alone with the detective. I don't know where to start," Mark said quietly, his voice trembling. "I was angry. Lisa, she exposed me in front of everyone. She showed them the texts, the pictures. She humiliated me. I never thought she would do that." Detective Hayes nodded slowly, taking in his words. "And then what happened?" Mark's eyes flickered briefly toward the doorway where Daniel was sitting. His son's face was red from crying, and Mark could feel the weight of his disappointment. But he couldn't look at him now, not when the guilt was so overwhelming. I lost control," Mark admitted. "I grabbed her, and she fell. I didn't mean to hurt her. I was just so angry. I didn't know what to do. And then I hit Carol. I didn't mean to, but I just couldn't stop myself." The detective leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "And where is Carol now? Is she still here?" Mark's voice faltered. She left right after everything happened. She was upset. I don't know where she went." Detective Hayes nodded again, making a mental note of the details. She had been trained to read people, to look for the cracks in their stories. Mark seemed to be genuinely remorseful, but something about his demeanor didn't sit right with her. He wasn't showing the level of panic she would expect from someone in his situation. He wasn't worried about the consequences. He was just empty. She needed more information. "I'll need you to come down to the station for a full statement," she said, standing up. "But before you leave, I need you to tell me exactly what happened when Lisa fell." "Did she hit her head?" Mark swallowed hard. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse. "She hit her head on the floor. It wasn't intentional, I swear. But she was She was unconscious after that. I thought she was just knocked out, but when Daniel tried to wake her up, she didn't respond. I, I didn't know what to do. Detective Hayes looked at him with a hard gaze. And when did you last see Carol? Mark hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting toward the door again. I don't know. She was upset, and I told her to leave. I don't know where she went. Mia Hayes nodded, but in her mind, doubts were already beginning to form. Mark's story wasn't adding up. He seemed to be withholding something, and she wasn't sure what it was yet. The police had already spoken to the paramedics and confirmed that Lisa had been found with signs of trauma to her head and neck. The next morning, the investigation into Lisa Johnson's assault was in full swing. Detective Mia Hayes had spent the night reviewing the statements taken from the family, and she was beginning to piece together a disturbing picture. But there was still something missing. One critical piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Mark's story, while coherent, lacked urgency. His admission of guilt was apparent, but his detached demeanor was concerning. His wife lay in critical condition, possibly fighting for her life. Yet he seemed to be more worried about the unraveling of his family than the consequences of his actions. There was also the matter of Carol's disappearance. She had been one of the last people to be with Mark when Lisa was attacked, and her absence was a glaring red flag. Detective Hayes had spent the morning canvassing the neighborhood for any surveillance footage or eyewitnesses. Unfortunately, no one seemed to have seen anything unusual. No one except for the neighbors who had heard raised voices from the Johnson home the night before. But now, as she sat in her car outside a local diner, waiting for the next lead to materialize, her phone buzzed. It was Officer Greg Dawson, one of her trusted colleagues. "Detective, we found something," Greg said, his voice clipped and serious. "We've tracked down Carol. She checked into a hotel last night under a different name. She's not answering calls, but we've got her location." "Where is she?" Mia asked, sitting up straighter, her pulse quickening. "East Side Motel, room 214. She's alone." Mia didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." The East Side Motel wasn't much to look at, a low-budget establishment on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where people came for a night or two, hoping to keep a low profile. But it wasn't the kind of place where someone like Carol Johnson should have been. When Mia entered the small, dimly lit office of the motel, she was greeted by an elderly woman behind the counter. The woman didn't ask questions, just handed over the key to room 214 after confirming Carol's name on the guest list. Mia made her way down the narrow hallway, her boots echoing off the walls. As she approached the door to Carol's room, she took a moment to steady herself. This wasn't just another routine interview. It felt like the moment everything would click. She had a feeling that Carol knew more than she was letting on, and if Carol was hiding something, now was the time to uncover it. She knocked firmly on the door. "Ms. Johnson, it's Detective Hayes. I need to speak with you." There was a long silence. Mia pressed her ear to the door, but there was no sound from inside. Just as she was about to knock again, the door creaked open. Carol stood in the doorway, her eyes red and puffy as if she had been crying. Her hair was messy, and she looked as though she hadn't slept a wink. I don't want to talk to anyone," Carol said, her voice shaking. "I just need to be alone." "Carol, we both know that's not going to happen," Mia said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You were there last night. You were with Mark. You know what happened to Lisa. Please, I need you to help me understand what went down." Carol swallowed hard, her face pale as she stepped aside, allowing Mia to enter. The room was small, with a single bed and a rundown desk. It looked like the kind of place where someone came to escape, even if just for a short while. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Carol said, her voice cracking as she sat down on the bed, her hands trembling. I just wanted him to choose me. I didn't want to get caught up in their mess." "But everything exploded, Detective. I didn't know how to stop it." Mia took a seat across from her, her eyes narrowing. "Start from the beginning. What happened when you went to the Johnson house?" Carol wiped her eyes, looking down at the floor for a moment before speaking. "I was there. I wasn't planning on staying long. I didn't think it would get so messy. But then Lisa said what she said, and I couldn't keep quiet anymore. She told everyone about me, about Mark and me." Mia stayed quiet, waiting for Carol to continue. It was like everything just exploded. Mark was furious. He didn't want anyone to know, but he also didn't want to let me go. And Lisa, Carol paused, her voice faltering. Lisa was so angry. She, she was humiliating him, Detective. She was tearing him down in front of his family, and it pushed him over the edge. He snapped. Carol's voice became softer, filled with guilt. I tried to stop him. I swear I did. I begged him to calm down. I tried to pull him away from her when he grabbed her, but it was like he wasn't hearing me. It all happened so fast. Mia leaned forward slightly, sensing Carol's unease. Did you see Mark hit Lisa? Did you see how she fell? Carol nodded slowly, her eyes widening with the memory. Yes, he shoved her to the ground. The police station was cold and sterile, a place where people came to face their worst fears. Carol sat in an interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly together on the table, her face pale and drawn. Detective Mia Hayes sat across from her, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. She had been in this room countless times, but today it felt different. Today, Carol Johnson was the key to unraveling the truth, and Mia could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. Carol had refused to speak when they first arrived at the station, but Mia knew she wouldn't be able to keep her silence for long. The walls in this room had a way of closing in on people, pushing them to confess, and Mia had the feeling that Carol was already beginning to crack. So, Carol, Mia began, her voice calm but deliberate, we've already spoken to the paramedics. They confirmed Lisa was severely injured after the fall. We know she was unconscious when she was found. What we don't know is what happened after you left the Johnson house. We don't know how bad it really was. Carol's eyes flickered briefly, but she kept her gaze lowered. Her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the situation had finally settled in. She had known this moment was coming. She had known she couldn't run from the truth forever. I didn't leave because I wanted to, Carol said, her voice shaking slightly. I thought... She broke off, her chest heaving with a shaky breath. I thought if I stayed, I'd be in danger too. I didn't know if Lisa was dead, and I didn't want to be blamed for anything. I didn't want anyone to think I had a part in it. Mia remained silent, letting the words hang in the air. She could see Carol struggling with the guilt, trying to come to terms with her actions. But Mia also knew that the longer Carol hesitated, the more she would be tied to the crime. Carol, Mia said, her tone firm but empathetic. We both know you were there when it happened. You saw what Mark did to Lisa. You saw him hurt her. Now you need to tell me everything. No more lies, no more hiding. If you help me now, it might make a difference. Carol looked up at Mia, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but closed it again. A single tear slid down her cheek. Finally, she spoke. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered. I didn't know what to do when Mark lost it. I didn't think he would go that far. I thought it would just be a fight, something they'd yell at each other about. But when he shoved her, she hit her head so hard. I didn't know if she was alive or not, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't be part of it. Mia leaned forward, her voice steady and direct. But you didn't just leave, Carol. You stayed, you watched, and then you ran. You ran when things got real. When you saw that Mark was in a panic, you didn't call the police. You didn't help. You left. I was scared, Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was scared of what Mark might do next. I didn't know if he was going to hurt me or if he was going to hurt someone else. He was out of control. He told me to leave. He said if I didn't, he'd make sure I was dragged into this mess too. He said I didn't know what he was capable of, and I believed him. Mia's mind raced as she processed the information. Mark had told Carol to leave. He had given her an ultimatum. And instead of calling the police, instead of staying to make sure Lisa was okay, Carol had fled, out of fear for her own safety. It was a story that made sense, but there was something else gnawing at Mia, something she couldn't shake. Did Mark hurt you, Carol? Did he touch you, threaten you in any way? Mia asked carefully, studying Carol's face for any sign of dishonesty. Carol shook her head quickly, her voice rising in panic. No, he didn't hurt me. He scared me. He told me to leave and not come back. He said he'd take care of everything. I I thought I was protecting myself by leaving. I didn't want to get caught in this mess. Mia took a deep breath. There was still one more thing to ask. Why didn't you tell the truth when you were first questioned? Why didn't you tell me what happened last night? Why did you lie? Carol hesitated again, her eyes flickering toward the door, as though she were looking for an escape. Because I was scared. I thought if I told the truth, I'd be arrested too. I didn't want to go to jail. I didn't want anyone to think I was a part of it. But now I know I can't hide anymore. I have to tell you what happened. I have to tell you everything. Mia nodded. She could feel the shift in Carol's demeanor. The woman was finally starting to crack, to accept the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just Mark who had caused this tragedy. It was both of them. Carol had been an active participant in the chain of events that led to Lisa's injury. The days after Carol's confession moved slowly, but the weight of the investigation pushed Detective Mia Hayes forward with relentless determination. Now she stood at the precipice of the final confrontation, ready to bring Mark Johnson in for questioning. The web of lies had started to unravel, and Mia could feel herself closing in on the truth. But the final pieces, the ones Mark was so desperately trying to protect, remained out of reach. Mia wasn't about to let him get away. She stood outside the Johnson house, her eyes scanning the quiet suburban neighborhood. The house, once a symbol of family and stability, now seemed like a monument to deception. It was time to face Mark, to confront him with everything she knew, and to get the confession that would tie everything together. Mia had already spoken to the district attorney, who had issued a warrant for Mark's arrest. They had the evidence now. The testimony of Carol, the witness statements, the physical evidence from the scene. It was all stacking up, and Mark would be hard-pressed to deny his involvement. But Mia knew there was a danger in underestimating him. Mark Johnson wasn't an ordinary suspect. He was a man with a family, a man who had lived a life of privilege, and one who, despite his mistakes, was still trying to cling to the image of the man he once was. Mia rang the doorbell, her expression resolute. She had spent the past few days planning her approach, but she knew Mark would try to fight back, to manipulate the situation to his advantage. She needed to be prepared for that. The door opened, and Mark stood before her, his eyes dark and weary. "Detective Hayes," he said, his voice cool, almost disinterested. "What's this about? Is this really necessary?" "Mark Johnson, you're under arrest for the assault of your wife, Lisa Johnson," Mia said flatly, showing him the arrest warrant. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Mark's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching. For a moment, Mia thought he might resist, but instead he stepped back, his hands raised slightly in mock surrender. "You don't know what you're talking about, Detective," Mark said, his voice growing colder. "I didn't do anything. My wife, she was out of control. She brought this all on herself." Mia remained impassive. She had heard enough of Mark's excuses to know that this would be a battle of wits. He wasn't going to give up easily, but she had the upper hand. She gestured for him to step outside, signaling that the arrest was happening whether he liked it or not. "Mark," Mia said, her voice firm but calm, "the evidence is clear. We have statements from witnesses who saw you shove Lisa to the ground. We know you were there, and now we know that you tried to cover up what happened. You told Carol to leave the house, to run, while you stayed behind and dealt with the aftermath of what you did. And we also know you were the one who escalated the situation." Mark's face hardened as he heard the words, his hands tightening into fists. "You don't understand, Detective. You don't understand what it was like living with her. She was driving me crazy. She wouldn't stop humiliating me. She wasn't who she used to be. She was unbearable." Mia's eyes locked onto Mark's, her voice calm but cutting. "I understand, Mark. I understand that you were angry and that you felt cornered. But what I don't understand is why you chose violence. Why you chose to hurt her instead of walking away. You had a choice, and you made the wrong one." Mark stood there, speechless for a moment, his anger building in the silence. Then finally he broke. "It was just a shove, just a push. I didn't mean to hurt her. I thought she'd get up. I didn't know she'd hit her head like that. I didn't mean for this to happen. But she kept pushing me and I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped." Mia's heart pounded as she listened to him. This was the confession she had been waiting for, but it wasn't the one she had hoped for. It was full of excuses, full of justification. But beneath the words, Mia could hear the truth. Mark knew what he had done, and he knew it wasn't just a simple accident. He had pushed her, and he had left her to suffer. Mark, it wasn't just a push. You escalated the situation. You didn't stop there, did you? Mia pressed, her voice soft but insistent. You made sure Carol ran, so no one could tie you to the crime? And when you knew Lisa was unconscious, you didn't call for help. You didn't make sure she was okay. You left her there to die, Mark. You thought you could cover your tracks. But you can't run from this anymore. Mark's face twisted in rage. He took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you know me, don't you? You think you can judge me. You think you can just come in here and make me a villain. You don't know what it's like to be married to someone like her.